Well, welcome back. We're here with Dr. Claire Parkinson. Claire, we were talking earlier about polar bears and sea ice, and I understand that you've actually been to both the Arctic and the Antarctic.
Yes, indeed. I actually went to the Antarctic first. I went to the Antarctic when I was still a graduate student, and that was thrilling to be able to go. It was actually very unusual for a woman to get to go at that time. It was back in 1973, and almost no women had been to the Antarctic in a research capacity before then. So it was very unusual. I was really pleased to get that chance. I was the only female on the ship going down. I was the only female on the expedition. I was the only female on the island that we were on. We were on an island that's just off Antarctica. It's called Deception Island. It's a volcanic island, and it had erupted a couple of years earlier, and we were looking at the ice that was flowing back into the crater that had erupted a few years earlier, and the leader of the expedition was Hughes. Again, I was a graduate student at the time, so I was thrilled to get to go on this expedition. On Deception Island, there are many, many, many thousands of penguins, so we saw lots of penguins on Deception Island, but the most exciting part was we got to do some scientific research, and this is one huge plus of being involved in earth sciences. You do sometimes get to go out on an expedition and actually do exciting things, and so in my case I get to go to both polar regions.
Well, let's talk about the science in just a second, but first, let's just talk about a typical day. Give us the logistics. You wake up, are you in a mummy sleeping bag? Are you in a building? I mean, just how does your day actually work and function?
Okay, in the Antarctic case, woke up, I was in like a mummy sleeping bag. The sleeping bags were wonderful. We were definitely kept warm by the body heat, our own body heat in the sleeping bag, because there was no other heat in that room. And so therefore the sleeping bag was critically important. So we'd get up, we would have breakfast, and then we had one official task that we had to do every day, which was to make radio contact with a ship in the vicinity. We were funded, like all U.S. research expeditions to Antarctica, we were funded by the National Science Foundation, NSF, and they required that we make this radio contact. Now sometimes we could make it very easily. Sometimes it would take like 2 hours just to make the radio contact.
And is this for safety reasons?
This is for safety reasons. They wanted to make sure we were okay, especially since this was a volcanic island we were on. So that was our first task, and sometimes that took over an hour, sometimes it just took a few minutes. Once we had that task done, then we got into a little rubber type boat called a Zodiac. We got into a Zodiac and went across a water area to get to the other side of the island and where our research expedition was.
It was the time of the year when the water wasn't frozen then?
Yes, this was in December and January, and this is Antarctica, so the seasons are just the reverse from the Arctic, and so therefore it was the summertime.
What was the typical high for the day and low for the day?
It was not all that cold because it was summertime, and in the Antarctic and in the Arctic too, both cases, in the summertime you've got sunlight pretty much all day long, so it wasn't all that cold. The high might have been close to the freezing point, and then the low might have been 10-15 degrees below that.
Now, I read somewhere that you're an old New Hampshire girl, so this wasn't really Vermont.
Yes.
So this really wasn't all that cold for you then.
This was definitely not that cold. We had some colder temperatures in the Arctic expedition, but this one in the Antarctic wasn't that cold because we were up toward the northern or most equatorward portion of the Antarctic, and so and in the summertime.
Okay.
So it wasn't wasn't all that cold. So anyway, then we would go in this Zodiac boat across this passageway to get to our research area, and then we would do surveying. So we were carefully surveying, and since we were looking at the ice flow coming down into a crater, sometimes it was kind of like steep slopes on ice, so it was kind of tricky sometimes.
Did you have to go out on those slopes then, and
well,
you were
at some
measuring
points,
thickness
yes.
of ice, or what were you measuring?
We were measuring the flow of the ice, and so basically we were surveying the ice, and then some stakes had been put on the ice in a previous expedition the prior year, and we were resurveying some of those to see how much the ice had flowed in that interim period.
And if the ice had, over the year, had moved a foot, what would that tell you?
Well, that was helping us to determine how fast the ice was going back into the crater, and it was all part of Terry Hughes, the leader of the expedition, his bigger plans regarding doing a bigger project on the stability of the West Antarctic ice sheet, which that was way back in 1973. People are still talking about the stability of the West Antarctic ice sheet. So Terry was way ahead of his time, and I was thrilled to be able to be a part of that expedition, even
Okay.
as a graduate student.
So at the end of the day, you motored back.
At the end of the day, we come back across this water passageway, and then we would have dinner. The one recreational thing that was available was there was a ping pong table, and there were two groups, and one was the American expedition that I was on, the other was an Argentine expedition. They spoke Spanish, we spoke English, and we would have these great ping pong games, but every once in a while, since we were keeping score in English and they were keeping score in Spanish, all of a sudden one team would think they had won and the other team wouldn't think the game was over yet. So sometimes there was a little language problem there, but that was the one recreational thing we had. But then we did have, like, in order to get water, there was a well, and we would get the water from the well, and so we would use the water from the well to do whatever we needed water for, like drinking it or washing the dishes or anything else we needed.
Now, in those days, of course, there was no satellite communication, no internet. So were you fairly isolated then?
It was very different from people who go to the Antarctic or the Arctic now. We were isolated so that, like our families did not know how we were doing until we got back, and whereas now people go and they have communication multiple times a day with their families sometimes, just in terms of internet connectivity.
Interesting. Well, I want to go back to the science.
Different.
I apologize for interrupting. I want to go back to the science, but we're going to have to take a short break.
Okay.
So we're going to take a break. Please stay with us. Well, welcome back. Claire, that must have been pretty exciting, but you were also pretty isolated. And wasn't there around the turn of the century another group that ran into some trouble?
Yes, indeed, a very famous case of an expedition that was totally lost in the Antarctic. Everybody died. Was Robert Scott's expedition to the South Pole. Theirs was the second group that reached the South Pole. The first was a Norwegian expedition that was on the continent at the same time and got there first, and that was led by Amundsen. But Scott's expedition had several goals, reaching the pole being one, which they did do, but they didn't get back safely. They all died on the way back. So it was a very tragic expedition, but they did a lot of science along the way. But then they did die on the way back.
And what happened? Did they get trapped by storms, or?
It was storms, it was cold, and they all froze. And one by one, so it wasn't like they all froze together. It was one by one they died.
And that was really only about 60 years before you were there.
Yes, but in those 60 years, there certainly was a lot of progress made, and by that time, going to the Antarctic was far easier than it had been when Scott went there. For one thing, we got most of the way down there by plane, whereas he went down by ship.
Okay, but you told me earlier you were sleeping in an unheated bedroom, though.
No,
so.
it was definitely unheated.
Definitely.
No, it was definitely unheated, and we did not have internet, so it was kind of halfway in between.
Halfway in between.
Versus today, when people have this worldwide connection with the internet, versus Scott, who they didn't realize the expedition had ended tragically until many, many months after, when they finally found the bodies. So, I mean, it was definitely, in England, it was just came as such a shock many months after, because they kept expecting the team to show up.
Did he ever actually make it to the South Pole?
Yes, they did. Yes, they made it to the South Pole, but it must have been incredibly discouraging because they were hoping to be the first to the South Pole. They made it to the South Pole and saw the Norwegian flag there. So it was very discouraging, but it sure showed that both the groups, both the Norwegian and the English groups, really had good surveying tactics to figure out exactly where the South Pole was, because they didn't have GPS units at that time.
Right.
So I mean, it was very much more difficult than it would be today to figure out exactly where you are.
We've talked a little bit about Antarctica, but you've also been to the Arctic.
Yes, and in fact, one expedition to the Arctic, we actually went to the exact North Pole. That was cool. We spent a week first in a little community called Resolute Bay up in northern Canada, and that in itself was very interesting because we spent a lot of time there, like with the children and with the school, with the school's principal, and we did some webcasts between that school in northern Canada, which is Inuit students, and schools in the U.S. So it was very interesting to do that. And then we went to the North Pole, and we had one stop. We had two stops on the way. One was in Eureka, which is on Ellesmere Island, up just to the west of Greenland, and that was at 80 degrees north. And then we slept over in tents there, and then to get all the way to the North Pole, we actually, the planes that took us most of the way to the North Pole, the day before went halfway to put some fuel down because the fuel and us and our luggage couldn't all fit on the plane, and so they had to put a fuel cache. And so when we went that next day, then We stopped at the fuel cache, which was on a floe of ice, and picked up the fuel, dumped off the fuel that had been used, dumped off the empty cans of fuel,
Right.
and then went on to close to the North Pole. We knew that getting to the exact North Pole would be very difficult on a plane because the North Pole is such that the ice is floating around. It's not like Antarctica, where the ice is on land at the South Pole, and you can actually have a runway at the South Pole to make sure you get where you want. And the North Pole, it's floating ice. It's an ocean, the Arctic Ocean. And so the ice is floating around, and so whether you can land at the North Pole or not all depends on how big the flow is at the North Pole at that moment, and it's changing from day to day.
So how far away from the pole did you land?
So we landed about 2 miles away, but we had it all pre-planned. We hooked up with a dog sled team. The dog sleds can get you right there to the North Pole as long as there's ice at all. So we hooked up with the dog sled team. We got about 2 miles from the North Pole by plane. We hooked up with this dog sled team, and then we got to the exact North Pole, and we took measurements of the ice thickness there.
How did you know you were exactly right at the North Pole?
Well, we took multiple measurements, and we did have GPS units by now, and so everybody agreed with all their devices that it was the exact North Pole. So
Now, I remember as a kid, you think of the North Pole, it looks like there's a barber pole right there. It's got the red stripes and some icicles hanging down, and you didn't find one of those, did you?
We did not find anything like that, but one thing that I specifically wanted to do, and I was so pleased to be able to do it, I wanted to pay attention to the sun through the course of the day, and indeed, the sun stayed just about level on the horizon, and it went all the way around. And that was cool. I knew that's what it was supposed to look like, but it's cool to actually see it.
Yeah,
To see the sun just about the exact same. So, 24 hours a day it was sunlight because it was actually late April, but at the North Pole, basically you have 6 months with the sun above the horizon and then 6 months with it below the horizon. So at the exact North Pole, you've got one sunrise a year, and that's about March 22nd, and you've got one sunset a year, which is about September 22nd. And so if you're there in between March 22nd and September 22nd, then the sun's going to be at whatever level it's at. It'll stay just about exactly that level, go all the way around. Of course, it's not really the sun going around, it's the Earth that's rotating around, but in terms of what it looks like, the sun stays about that same level, goes all the way around. So it was very cool.
Now, I think a lot of our viewers know, or maybe not, that polar bears are at the North Pole and penguins are at the South Pole. Did you see any polar bears while you were up there?
I did not see any polar bears, and actually, although it would have been neat to see a polar bear, all of us realized that it was best not to see a polar bear.
That makes sense.
In fact, we all did, one of the requirements we had was we had to take so-called rifle training. When we were still at Resolute Bay, we did have a little session of rifle training, and we did take rifles with us just in case there was a polar bear that was looking for food that humans could satisfy. So none of us was wanting to have to shoot a polar bear. So from that respect, it was very nice we did not encounter a
That's
polar
good. So
bear.
how long were you there, and then you, did the same process in reverse to get back to Resolute Bay?
Yes, we did. We did do that same process in reverse. We were not there very long at all because we were just up there to take a few measurements and to do these webcasts on the internet. So we were only there on the order of days instead of a long expedition.
And what year was this?
That was 1999.
1999. I was going to say, and the Aqua satellite wasn't launched until 2002, right?
That's
So
right.
it couldn't take a picture of you.
That's exactly right.
Claire, that must have been really exciting, and we talked also about Antarctica. If you had a chance to go on another expedition, where would you go? What would you do? Or would you go back to Vermont? I mean, some people think that's an expedition in itself.
I've always liked Vermont, so Vermont would be a nice place to go. I'm not that much of a traveler, actually. I was extremely pleased to get to go both to the Antarctic and also to the Arctic a couple of times. And because it's so important to actually see what you're studying, so it's so important to see it. But my work really is concentrated on the satellite data, which gets us the global picture. And so most of my work is in my office. And so in terms of the expeditions, although I'd be happy enough to go back to either Antarctica or the Arctic, it's not something that I'm dying to do. Some people go on these expeditions every year. It's sort of like an annual thing for them. But in my case, my work is dominated by work in my office.
Claire, we've talked about your adventures, your work, but how did you first get into this?
Actually, as a child, my keen interest was math. As a child, math was just overwhelmingly what I was most interested in intellectually. I loved its precision. I loved the fact that by a proper choice of symbolism, questions that sound so difficult end up becoming so simple. So I loved the simplicity, I loved the power, I loved the beauty of math. So I really loved math. That was overwhelmingly what I was most interested in. When I got close to finishing up my undergraduate career in college, I became concerned that if I went into theoretical math, I didn't know what the math might end up being used for. And I was worried that what if I develop some equations that end up being used to build a better bomb or for some other purpose that would appall me. So I decided I have to get out of theoretical math, even though that's what I loved. I had to get out of that. And so that's when I started thinking about science instead. And I ended up deciding that I'd really like to go to Antarctica, and because of a number of factors. One is cold, isolated, but also the Antarctic Treaty. There's this treaty that was signed in 1959, this wonderful Antarctic Treaty that preserves the continent of Antarctica for peaceful purposes only. And all the major nations of the world have signed on to this treaty, saying that they will not make new claims for land in it, that it's going to be open for scientific research, a whole continent open for scientific research, for collaboration between the nations, and this just was tremendously appealing to me. So I decided I'd like to go to Antarctica, and I found out that the way to go to Antarctica was to become a graduate student and get on an Antarctic expedition. So I did that, and then after that I ended up becoming interested in climate modeling, and so I ended up for my dissertation work doing modeling of sea ice in the Arctic and the Antarctic. And when I got done with that and I gave a talk on the model, there was an individual from NASA who was in the audience, and he asked me, well, do you know what you're doing once you get your degree? And I said, no, I've been so busy working on the dissertation, I don't know what I'm going to do when I get the degree. And he said, well, what would you think about working for NASA? And it was just so overwhelmingly my first choice. I mean, working for NASA, it had never really occurred to me that I could maybe work for NASA, and that just became just overwhelmingly my first choice. And so then I started working for NASA, and since then, I've been doing work on satellite observations of sea ice and other aspects of the climate system.
That sounds like a great story. We're going to have to take a short break. Please stay with us. We'll be right back.
Satellites are so valuable to us in terms of showing us where hurricanes are and how they're tracking well before they reach land. Another really valuable aspect is the satellites show fires really well. That's really valuable for the U.S. Forest Service to determine where to deploy firefighters. And one of the things I've really enjoyed doing is getting to write books. Linda had mentioned that I've written several books, and I enjoy both writing them by myself, and the two on the left I did by myself, but I also enjoy working with other people and writing books that are either edited with other people or written with other people, and one of those is on the right. And then last slide is 3 more of my books. The one on the left was actually history of science, because I'm really interested in the history of science also. And then the one in the middle is modeling of science, and that was with colleague Warren Washington. And then the one at the bottom right, we actually have copies. We have copies for everybody here if you would like copies. We have copies both of the book, if you would like those, and also small versions of the 6 posters.
Well, welcome back. We've had a wonderful time talking about Antarctica and your adventures down there. Any last words for our viewers?
Well, I would say that becoming a scientist is a wonderful career. You get to do such exciting things, not just the field work, but also science is an attempt to understand something about the world, and if you become a scientist, you actually get paid for doing that. So it's a fantastic career to go into, and there's so many different options if you do go into science as a career.
Dr. Parkinson, thank you very much for being on the show. That's our show for this morning. Thanks for watching. Please catch us next time.
Okay, now that's it.